Alright, what's up guys, it's Ben, and today I'll be reviewing The World Is Yours, Rich the Kid's debut album. The New York native has been making waves lately through the singles New Freezer and Plug Walk and the so-called beef he has with Lil Uzi Vert. I'll be reviewing the album through an overview, key takeaways, flow, lyricism, production, features, highlights, lowlights, enjoyment factor, concept, and finish it off with a conclusion. Let's get into it. So firstly, let's get started with an overview. Rich the Kid is a modern rapper that just raps about flexing and getting money, and this album succeeded in doing that. It just became boring and repetitive as it went along. Let's get started with flow. Rich the Kid tends to use the same flow that is heavily ad-libbed and overall unimpressive. There were no points throughout the album that stood out with his flow. It was just repetitive and mediocre. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great by any stretch, so Flow will get an average SkeenScore of 5 out of 10. I was broke, but now I'm flexing. Ain't no question, ain't no fucking second guessing. Next up is lyricism. The lyricism on The World Is Yours is just about as average as lyricism can possibly get. Rich the Kid raps about women, money, lean, and anything else that could be defined as flex rap. It should be noted that this album wasn't expected to have impressive lyricism, as it is Rich the Kid after all, but it's below average and quite frankly boring, so we'll give it a SkeenScore of 3 out of 10. Next up is production. The production should have been a highlight for this album, as bass-heavy instrumentals are one of the defining points of modern rap, but there wasn't any sort of experimental beats on this album. They weren't bad, they were just a bit repetitive, and the beats were well made and good, above average even, but just the lack of experimentation or anything new with the production leads to a SkeenScore of 7 out of 10. And now for features. The World Is Yours had an extremely high amount of features, a total of 11 on an album with only 14 tracks. Kendrick Lamar was the first of these on the song New Freezer, and he came with a verse that fit the themes of the album. It sounded good, but it wasn't the most impressive Kendrick verse of all time by any means, but it wasn't bad by any stretch either. Future was the next feature on the song No Question, and just like Kendrick, his verse fit the themes of the album, but it was just about as standard as Future can get. At least it didn't have any la-di-da-di-das. Two Gone had the next feature, coming from Khaled. Is it Khalid? I don't know. And while Khaled's lyrics on the chorus weren't similar to anything we've seen from Khaled in the past, his smooth vocals carried a very catchy hook. Rick Ross was next on the song Made It, and his verse had surprising lyricism for a Rick Ross verse. It wasn't perfect, but it impressed me personally. Rick Ross always seems to outperform the lead artist on the tracks that he features in. Jay Critch was also featured on Made It, and he had a quick flow that really fit the production, and this verse alone is enough to make me want to listen to more Jay Critch in the future. Drippin' held the next feature from Chris Brown, and while it has a pretty meaningless lyricism to it, it sounded good, and it was a pretty standard feature. Quavo was next on Lost It, and it was about as standard as Quavo can get. It wasn't great or bad, it was just mediocre at best. Offset had two features, his first on Lost It with Quavo, and I preferred Offset's verse to Quavo's. It was also pretty standard for Offset, but it was good nonetheless. His next feature was on Gargoyle, and Offset had the best verse on the song, but the song itself was bad enough I wouldn't come back to it just to hear Offset again. Lil Wayne was next, and he was featured on the song End of Discussion, and his verse disappointed me. His voice was a little bit more nasally than normal, and it was unenjoyable. Trippie Redd was the next feature on Early Morning Trappin', and his feature was fantastic. It was by far my favorite on the album, and he was able to make it seem like Rich the Kid was the feature on Trippie's song, and that's pretty impressive. His verse and bridges all sounded great, although they weren't very lyrical, but it just fit the aesthetic of this album very well. Sway Lee was the final feature on the track Gargoyle with Offset, and this entire song was obnoxious. What Sway Lee brought wasn't bad, but it wasn't something that I would want to return to. It's interesting that all of the features did better on their verses than Rich the Kid ever did on his, so it's probably a good thing that there were so many on the album. The features were a driving force for The World Is Yours, and for that reason, features will receive a SkeenScore of 8 out of 10. And now for some highlights. There weren't very many highlights on The World Is Yours because it all sounded the same. But Plug Walk stood out. It's just a super catchy track, even though it's not great in any other way apart from just sounding nice. Drippin' also stood out because of how it sounded. These two songs I'll definitely download, but everything else is sort of take it or leave it. Yo, pussy slipping. All my cars, all my bras is exotic. And now for lowlights. Just like highlights, there aren't very many lowlights on The World Is Yours, but Gargoyle definitely stands out as the worst song on the album. It's obnoxious and annoying, and it would have been better left off the album, just like Take Off was left off Bad and Bougie.
I done brought my gang with me, fresh out the freezer, my eyes dripping, money coming in my life different.
And now for the enjoyment factor. While it might seem like I hated the album, I didn't. It was surprisingly enjoyable because it just sounds good. It's the sort of music you would want to play in the car or work out to, and it's definitely good for those. I enjoy this album quite a bit, and I'll probably return to most of the tracks.
Pull off with your thotty, I just got that raw. Pack, touchdown.
Next up is Concept. The World Is Yours is another album without a concept, but it's meant to be a flex rap type of album, and it definitely succeeds in doing that. Concept is sort of a get it or you don't score, and since this album succeeded in flexing, it received a SkeenScore of 10 out of 10. However, this isn't meant to be a conceptual album, so this will be exempt from the final SkeenScore. In conclusion, The World Is Yours isn't bad. It's not great either, but it sounds good, and I think it's a strong debut for Rich the Kid, although in the future I'd like to see him experiment a bit more, because an album where the features are the driving force should be left to producers, not rappers. So, all in all, The World Is Yours by Rich the Kid receives a SkeenScore of 5.75 out of 10. And real quick before this video ends, my review of Blonde will be going up soon. I've been super busy and I haven't had time, but make sure that you visit the straw poll in the description to vote for the album that I'll be reviewing next week. And also, I tried to have a face cam set up for this video and for the one over Blonde, but it didn't work out because for some reason the video camera just wouldn't be found by my computer and I couldn't get the clips onto my computer. So I'm going to have to order a webcam here pretty soon. So I'm sorry about that, but I'll see you guys soon.